Welcome to the World Affairs Council of the Monterey Bay Area. We hope you enjoyed the following quick take on international affairs while we all wait out the COVID pandemic. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Grzymala-Busse. I'm a professor at Stanford University, and today I'll be talking about populism and the erosion of democracy in Poland and in Hungary. And I'll basically be making 3 points about the rise of populism in Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere, what the causes of this rise are, and what the potential consequences might be. So first, what is populism? We hear a lot about populism. Parties, politicians, and movements are all said to be populist. But what I'm going to argue is that there's a sort of a common definition, 2 common characteristics that all populists share, no matter whether they're left or right in Europe or in Latin America. The first of this is that all populists claim that the elites are a corrupt, self-serving cartel. 2, they also argue that as a result, people need to be better represented and their interests need to be better articulated. And so what populist parties basically do is to argue that the existing elites are bad, the people are good, and they need to be better represented. Now, the implications of this definition is twofold as well. First, liberal democratic institutions are not to be trusted. They are the creatures of this corrupt elite cartel. And as a result, parliaments, courts, other institutions simply are not worthy of trust. Instead, populist leaders and parties prefer to go through direct representation. They would much rather have rallies and plebiscites and referenda. And they want to politicize the state. They want to basically to have political control over courts, the media, and other institutions, because they feel that way popular interests can better be represented in the face of this elite cartel. Secondly, if, as populist parties claim, the people are to be represented, they first have to be defined. And this is where populist parties tend to define their own supporters as good patriots and their opponents, or those who don't share them and share their commitments, as traitors, as basically not worthy of representation or frankly of political life. And the problem is that in Europe, parties espousing these views have really increased in support. As you can see from this graph, the lower green line are the developed democracies of Europe. And starting around in the mid-90s, they basically go from being less than 5% of the vote to getting almost 20% by last year. In the newer democracies of Europe, the ones that are delineated here in red, we see that after 1989 and the collapse of communism and the first free elections, populist parties start off at much higher rates of support. They started for around 22 or so. And they basically go all the way up to 36, 35% of support as of last year. And so there's been a considered increase in the levels of support for populist parties and politicians. And what's worrisome here is that the early poster children of reform, places like Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, that were so lauded for making such enormous democratic progress early on, are the very places where you see the greatest populist takeoff, where we see the greatest support for these parties, where they enter the government and they really start to do some damage. Basically enter the government as opposed to simply being one of the opposition parties. And so we have a situation here where, this is Viktor Orban, a scruffy, charming young revolutionary of 1989 who sought democracy and the rule of law, becoming very quickly this rather bloated, jaundiced leader of an authoritarian populist party. And so in Hungary, the governing party right now is called Fidesz, which stands for the Party of Young Democrats, which became a conservative populist party in the 1990s. It made steady electoral gains in the 2000s and has held over 2/3 of the seats since 2010. And that's important because those 2/3 of seats means that they have a constitutional supermajority that can basically change the fundamental legal framework of the country. In Poland, we have PiS, the Law and Justice Party, led here by Jarosław Kaczyński, who is pictured. This is a party that is conservative and populist from the start, and for the last 5 years has governed Poland in a majority single-party government. They don't have a constitutional supermajority, but they basically have the overwhelming majority in parliament anyway. And this party basically views the post-89 changes in Poland as illegitimate, as a compromise between communists and liberals that sold out Poland's interest. This is also happening in the Czech Republic, where the Action of Dissatisfied Citizens was founded in 2011 by Andrej Babiš, who's pictured here. It basically critiques corruption, the European Union, and democratic institutions as basically corrupt and ineffective. It has held 30% or the plurality of seats since the October 2017 elections, and is working in cahoots with the president, Miloš Zeman, whose commitment to democracy is equally questionable. So the question is, why do we see this? Why do we have this sort of switch from these young, committed Democrats to these hardened populist authoritarians? Well, there are multiple explanations. Some have focused on economics and the kind of economic crisis that swept through Europe in the mid-2000s. And that might explain Hungary, which suffered an enormous amount during the economic crisis, but not Poland or the Czech Republic or many of the other countries, which were absolutely fine. Some people have argued that this is immigration and the waves of immigration that swamped Europe that promoted basically a populist backlash. But there was almost no immigration to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, all of which basically erected barriers along their borders and denounced any kind of immigration quotas that the European Union was trying to impose on them. There's also, of course, the question of international influence and the kind of interference that Russia has been promoting all over the place in an attempt to destabilize democracies. But that's not really happening in Poland, which is pretty immune to Russian interference thanks to a long history of extreme skepticism about Russia. So none of these seem to hold quite as nicely as we would like them to. But the one explanation that I think does explain why we see this rise of populism in Poland, Hungary, and many other countries is a failure of mainstream parties, of mainstream political parties, the kind of center-left, center-right parties that we associate with good governance. So how does this happen? And how did this happen in Poland and in Hungary? Well, we have to go back all the way to 1989 and the ways in which 1989 and the collapse of communism was this massive rejection of communism as a Soviet imperial project. The return to Europe was the dominant trope. This is where political leaders from across the spectrum basically all talked about. And consensus on democracy was really both the goal and an instrument of the collapse of communism. We have these stirring scenes of elite negotiations, not only in Poland and in Hungary, but elsewhere, where both the representatives of the opposition and of the communist regime come together to forge a new democratic consensus. And after communism collapses, through these negotiations, in some cases, and through revolutions in others, what emerges is a subsequent consensus on a return to Europe. And that basically means that these countries commit themselves to liberal democracy and the rule of law, however imperfect, to free markets and economies, and the often painful reforms that these countries have to undergo to move from planned economies to free markets, and the desirability of joining the European Union. That's kind of the project that all of these countries have in common as the unalloyed good of post-communism development. And this kind of consensus for a long time is actually incredibly useful. It means that democratic reforms can go through and democracy can be established in these countries. Without a consensus over democratic rules, you really can't have democracy. And all these countries establish that kind of a consensus. This also makes it possible to have economic reforms because whether left or right, whether post-communist or post-opposition, all these parties very carefully and systematically implement market reforms after 1989. So this kind of consensus really helps to build the impetus for regime reform. But it also leads to a failure of mainstream parties, because what it means is that given this consensus, parties are indistinguishable from each other. All the political parties look alike. They're not responsive, they're not particularly accountable, and above all, it's hard to tell what the different offers might be from these parties. This kind of depolitization, this kind of moving out of political debates and political disagreements into the realm of consensus and technocracy basically means that these countries can join the NATO and the EU. But where this kind of mainstream becomes this weak, where it can't offer differentiated political programs, where it can't respond to popular concerns and grievances, where it basically isn't talking about the issues that really matter to people, like immigration, or whether the EU really is such a great project. Under those conditions, populists prosper, because they are the one source of criticism and the one source of a willingness to shatter the consensus. They're basically the uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner who says the inconvenient things that nobody else who's too nice to say them would. So then what are the consequences of these populist parties coming to power in Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere? I would argue that once in office, we have to take them seriously and literally, because basically they lead to an erosion of formal institutions and the erosion of informal values that underpin democracy. Now, if you recall, this illiberal populist vision sees elites as a corrupt and unresponsive cartel, which means that the policies and institutions that these elites have imposed, the democratic rules that these elites have imposed, have to basically be raised and rebuilt from the ground up. At the same time, because these parties claim to represent the people, the institutions need to reflect the popular will, which basically means a partisan mandate for the electoral winners. If I win the elections, then however I shape the institutions represents the people because I'm a populist party. So this basically means extensive damage to formal institutions, informal norms, and in fact, the very definition of society. And I'll briefly walk you through that. So when it comes to formal institutions, in all these countries, the judiciary is the first target. And new laws basically politicize the judiciary and put it under the control of the parliament. So the judiciary loses its independence. Oversight and regulatory institutions are the next ones to go. So ombudsmen and regional governments are brought to heel. Civil society and universities are forced to re-register. And in the case of the Hungarian Central European University, they're forced to leave the country entirely. And if these parties have enough votes, they actually go after the entire legal framework. So in Hungary, because of that constitutional supermajority, we see Fidesz basically rewrite the entire constitution within 6 months of them gaining power in 2010. And the goal here is to both ensure incumbency and to minimize the costs of losing power, should that ever happen. And this is, of course, happening despite massive protests and mobilization. These are Hungarian protests against the new constitution. These are protests in Poland against the new media law and against the new laws on the constitution, against the new laws on the courts. Now, the second thing that these parties all go after are informal norms, right? These are the informal values that underpin democratic functioning. So these leaders criticize and dismiss the opposition as irrelevant at best and traitorous at worst. They denounce the media as fake news and limit media access to the parliament, to government press conferences, and so on. They basically absolutely refuse any norms of informal accountability, such as showing up their tax returns, showing who their donors are, conflict of interest norms are abandoned, and so on. So these kind of norms that aren't enforced by laws, but we would nonetheless expect democratic politicians to observe, are basically heavily undermined by these populists. And finally, there are the politics of identity. If these parties are going to represent the nation, they also want to redefine it. So they divide the society into good and bad, into a worst sort of poles, as Kaczynski called his opponents. They view the opposition as traitorous, and they argue that only certain groups really belong to the nation. This is, for example, the House of Terror in Budapest, which is a museum that was founded by the current governing party that basically equates communism with fascism and basically says that both are entirely illegitimate. Of course, it's very convenient that the main opposition to the ruling party happens to be from the former communist regime. And so this is a way of redefining what it means to be a true Hungarian and marginalizing the political opposition at the same time. This is a poster during the 2017 national referendum on immigration that basically says, let's not let Soros have the last laugh, right? George Soros as an example of an international financier who is Jewish and therefore unacceptable in the new Hungarian nation. Now, this is all a bit depressing, but it's not all bad news. It turns out that populist parties tend to be punished at higher rates than others, and support for democracy remains high. So as we can see, support for democracy remains high in all of these countries. Even in Poland and Hungary, you see close to 3/4 of the majority of the respondents supporting democracy as it's understood by the rest of us. Rule of law, freedom of association, majority rule with minority rights. And if you look at how voters punish populists, it turns out that populist parties are punished at much higher rates than other parties by voters after they've been in government. And in individual countries, we also see new presidents in Slovakia and Croatia that denounce populism. the defeat of populists in Greece, and the Italian sardine movement, which again articulates an opposition to these kinds of politics. But nonetheless, until then, we have a spate of illiberal populists in the region who are busy undermining the institutions of democracy that the elite consensus had earlier built. Thank you very much.